Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to dive in after taking a much needed break for a day yesterday, which was Saturday. We're going to dive fully into Microsoft Sentinel. We're going to watch a video from Microsoft Learn on how to prepare for the Microsoft Sentinel portion of the SC-200 exam. And we're going to just dive full into it. And then after the video, which is about an hour, we're going to dive into designing some of the settings they go over. We're going to review how to ingest logs through data collectors, and we're also going to review how to set up diagnostic settings. We're going to review how to connect in Defender 365, and we're also going to review how to connect in Defender for Cloud all into Microsoft Sentinel and review some logs in there and just review incidents as well. I want to start really pushing into it, so let's go ahead and get started. So this video link will be in the show notes as well, but this is the third video over Microsoft Sentinel from Microsoft Learn for preparing for the exam.
And welcome to our third and final functional group, which is on Microsoft Sentinel. It's going to be a big one because Microsoft Sentinel is 50% of the SC-200 exam. So everything from data connectors to automation to threat hunting is on the menu. So let's dive right in. All right. So in this functional group, we're looking at mitigating threats using Microsoft Sentinel. We're going to looking at designing and configuring the Sentinel workspace, planning and implementing the use of data connectors for ingesting data. We'll look at Sentinel analytics rules, some data classification and normalization. We'll look at the automated response, the SOAR capability in Sentinel, how to manage incidents within Sentinel, the idea of analytics and using workbooks to analyze the data that comes in through these different connectors, and hunting for threats using Sentinel. So first thing we need to figure out is how we're going to provision the log analytic workspaces for our Sentinel implementation. Sentinel runs on a log analytic workspace, so we really have three choices. We have single tenant, single workspace, single tenant with regional workspaces, and multi-tenant workspaces. So the trick for the exam is to know the reasons why you would do those. Understand why you might want to have multiple workspaces regionally based, well, for data sovereignty or some sort of data governance rules. If you have multiple tenants, know that that's going to require you to incorporate Lighthouse if you want a single pane of glass.
A great example here of a question that you may see on a test is a scenario-based question for planning for Microsoft Sentinel. For instance, the question may say something like, what scenario do you need to configure Azure Lighthouse to deploy Microsoft Sentinel? One of the answers may be, single tenant, single workspace, single tenant regional, right, or multi-tenant workspaces, right? The correct answer there is multi-tenant. You're looking for multi-tenant with Azure Lighthouse. That's a perfect example. Data sovereignty would be an example of a single tenant with regional.
But other than that, it's going to be fairly straightforward. You're going to fit your Sentinel configuration into one of those three elements. So now that we've talked about that, what are the roles that we could use to govern this kind of capability? Well, within Sentinel, much like we've seen with Defender for Cloud and 365 Defender, we're going to have some RBAC capability at its core. And the core RBAC roles that you'll see here are reader, responder, contributor, and automation contributor. Reader can view data, responder can manage incidents by assigning and dismissing them. Contributor can do that, plus they can create edit workbooks, analytic rules, and Sentinel resources. And automation contributor can also add playbooks to automation rules. Generally, automation contributor we wouldn't think of as something we assign to a user account, but know that it's there. So we've got the workspace, we've got roles. How do we manage this data? Certainly there are costs that we have to factor in with how much data we ingest and how long we intend to retain it. The key numbers to remember are 30 and 730. That's the data storage range that we can configure within Sentinel.
That's another easy question, right? how long can you store data for in a Microsoft Sentinel workspace? Answer you're looking for is 30 and 730.
Remember those numbers. You may get questions around how long can I keep this information, or how long can this data be stored. Note we can adjust this through the Log Analytics portal. You could use usage and estimated costs, and then there's a data retention button that will allow you to specify how many days you want to keep with that. Once again, know not just those values, that's important, but know how you set them and know that they can be configured explicitly.
So real quick, as we go through different pieces of this, I'll also be pulling up my demo instance just so we can review the settings as they see it, so you can see it live. So for this one, I think it's a good point to kind of see it. So let's take a look really quick. So we're already in Microsoft Sentinel. So we're going to go back into the Azure portal just so you can see it. So we're going to look for our Microsoft Sentinel workspace. For this one, we want to go into our settings. And we can see our pricing in Sentinel pricing. We're using pay-as-you-go. We can look at our settings. If we want to enable some settings in here, we can. We can also go to our workspace settings, which is where you'll see our usage and estimated costs that he was just referring to. So we can actually go in here, and since we're on pay-as-you-go, you don't get as much choices, but we can actually go to our data retention, which is what he was just referring to. We can actually change it and scroll. It's literally just a little button here. We just slide it across all the way up to the 730 like he stated, right? So right now I have it up to bare minimum to close out. You can set a daily cap if you want, right? We don't have that right now. We have to create an alert to do it, but you just need to know those settings exist.
Remember, this is going to be in two spaces. It's going to be in Sentinel and in the Log Analytics workspace associated with Sentinel. Now, we could also use the Microsoft Content Hub. That's a nice place where we can centrally discover and install any out-of-the-box content. It allows you to give more in-product discoverability, enabling end-to-end product, domain, or vertical out-of-the-box solutions, and management of content with Sentinel. The Content Hub is a good thing to know that there are solutions that are already built there for you. So notice that you can filter, look for content appropriate to what you're looking for. You can manage updates for out-of-the-box content. You can manage custom content through the Sentinel API. And you can also look at additional Sentinel information. There's will be an install and an update solution with a wizard-driven setup interface to allow you to build these out-of-the-box solutions. So, part of what the exam is going to be about with regards to Sentinel is how do you define what your Sentinel environment's going to be. Once you've defined what that environment's going to be, now we have to think about what is my Sentinel environment going to do? What kind of information am I going to pull into that? So this is where we get into our data sources. Data source ingestion is the heart of Sentinel. So once we've defined what our Sentinel environment's going to be, we want to look at what it's going to contain. What kind of data sources are we going to bring into Sentinel? We know that we have data from 365. We have data from Azure resources. We have data from on-prem resources. We have data from network appliances. All of those things have unique data connectors that we can connect to a Sentinel workspace. Moreover, we have the ability to author customized connectors. So whatever data sources we have available to us, we can create and connect those data sources into a Sentinel workspace. The goal being is that I want the information relevant to what I'm hoping to analyze in my individual Sentinel workspaces. Note that these data connectors are workspace specific. So if like in the previous example, we have multiple workspaces, each of those data connectors will need to be defined for each workspace. So we don't have to consistently put the same data in every workspace. We can go by relevancy to the given workspace.
So a great example there is you could have separate sources of data in each workspace if you're doing multi-regional Sentinel deployment. If it's a single pane of glass, you're obviously only going to have one log analytics workspace and one Sentinel workspace to work from, so all the connectors will be in just the one source. But if you have multiples, right, it's going to live wherever you need it. So for example, if you need a source in both, you're going to deploy it in both Sentinel workspaces.
Space. So if we're going to create a connector, each connector is unique. You think about the kinds of data that we're going to be ingesting. There are over 120 standard connectors. So everything from Azure Active Directory to third-party network appliances to other cloud providers. Each is going to have their own unique configuration, but generally there'll be a list of prerequisites and then another set of specific configuration steps. There'll be an option to create incidents based on that connector. You do not have to, but it is advisable if you're bringing this data into Sentinel. The only way you can get evaluation of that information is by generating incidents from it. That's the only way that Sentinel is going to recognize and generate output for you.
That's a huge flag that you should have. And you could get a question such as, how will you get incidents from the data you're collecting, right? And knowing that you need to enable the incidents button is huge. So let's go over what that looks like, right? So we're back on our Microsoft Sentinel workspace. We're going to go right back into the basic Sentinel. So we're back into the search box. We're going to go to Microsoft Sentinel, and under content management, right, you have Content Hub, repositories, communities, configurations, and then you have data connectors under configuration. Right, and so you can see my workspace already has some connectors, and we have 5 connected, right? So let's take a look at one we don't have connected, so I can show you. We don't have Defender for Cloud connected. So let's scroll over, and we can see that we can open the connector page by clicking the button, and so we can see everything we have on that, right? So prerequisites to integrate with Microsoft Defender for Cloud: make sure you have a workspace with read and write permissions. Standard tier is no longer required. It's available for all deployments of Microsoft Defender for Cloud. You need contributor permissions on the subscription for your Microsoft Defender for Cloud, right? And so to configure it, you need to connect Microsoft Defender for Cloud to Microsoft Sentinel, mark the checkbox for each, right? So we just have one subscription with it. So for instance, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, all subscriptions, if we had more than subscriptions, we would do it. And so we just hit that connected box. You can also hit enable all, right? And it'll load up this Defender plan. Maybe later. This is already on, so we're going to go back in. So we have it. We have our bidirectional sync now enabled, some enabled, so we should be good. So we'll click our button again. And so we see we now have 16 connectors with 6 connected. We should see our Defender for Cloud now connected. We do. And it's good to go. Right, so the green, as you see green next to your connectors, it also means that they're connected to your workspace. Right, so I might have 16 connectors installed, but I'm not collecting data for all 16. Let's go back to the video.
Now, that doesn't mean the data can't be leveraged in other ways, but usually, and you'll see a big recommended identifier with each of those to help you understand that, yeah, you want to generate it.
So remember that generate instance button, right? So let's go make sure we actually generate instance. You have to open the connector page. So we can usually that button has a little enable feature next to it. Let's see. Sometimes you have to let the connector sit for a second. And as you saw, it disappeared on me. And this happens every once in a while with anything in Microsoft Sentinel. You have to just kind of search back for it. Go back into it. We're going to go back to data connectors. And you can see it's having some issues. Alright, it's loading a little bit slow. So let's go back to that Microsoft Defender for Cloud again. Let's open up the connector page. So you have it connected. Okay, so let's let that one sit. So let's go back to the connectors and see if I can't show you one that already does have it. Trying to find one that shows us the incidents. Let's see if we can get it from Microsoft 365 Defender. Okay, so there we go. So this one has connect incidents, right? So connect Microsoft 365 Defender incidents to your Microsoft Sentinel. Incidents will appear in the incidents queue, and you can also turn off all Microsoft incident creation rules for these products, which is recommended, right? So you can connect incidents and alerts. Alright, so now we have incidents connected from our Microsoft 365 Defender XDR into Microsoft Sentinel.
Incidents in most cases. Now, once you've got that, what are some things that you can do, or some examples of things that you can use as data connectors? So you can see if 365 Defender connectors like Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, the Office 365, and Defender for Cloud Apps. You can configure Azure services like Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Identity Protection, DDoS protection, Cloud App Security, and so on. And then also connectors for other vendors. There's the Log Analytics data connector. There's the Common Event Format and Syslog connectors. And this is where I can really get into the customization piece. Because as long as we can ingest data in CEF format, literally there's nothing that we can't author connectors for. So know that there's this breadth of connector architecture, and that in order to do anything with log analytics, we have to ingest that data through.
So ingestion is huge with any SIM tool that you ever use. What you need to know, and what I think will be important to know for the test, is the different types of connectors, right? So this page is huge, but also where we can get those connectors from, how to connect them, and which ones are included in the free pricing tier and which ones are paid. I do think that'll come up on the test, and I wrote a Medium article about it, which will be in the show notes too.
Some data connector that will configure explicitly for that workspace. Now we can do that manually, but we also can do this through Azure Policy. You can also connect data, as I mentioned, through policy. Diagnostic setting-based connections are usually going to be policy-driven, which means they'll be managed by Azure Policy. So your procedure is going to be very similar. You're going to go in your data connectors, go to the connector page, go to configuration, and there'll be an option to log to the Azure Policy Assignment Wizard. You'll get a pre-generated name, but you'll have to configure the basics and parameters tab for that connector. Now, keep in mind that not every connector is managed by policy. So you can configure certain connectors, the diagnostic settings based one by policy. Know that distinction. Diagnostic settings based connections are going to come through or have the ability to be managed through Azure Policy. So one of the core connectors that you're going to want to know for the exam are 365 Defender, Defender for Cloud. They are objective domains already in the exam in and of themselves. So we're going to want to get that analysis piece of that information into something like Sentinel, so we can look for that fusion. We can look for that connection between those different services. We know that we can do hunting queries in 365 Defender, but if we can ingest that data into a larger repository like Defender for Cloud, now we get the ability to look at data across all the different platforms and create this kind of synergistic relationship between those two. That's a lot of what we want to think about when we're looking at, well, how are we going to be tested in the exam around Sentinel? Sentinel's goal ultimately is analytical. So the data connectors are providing that baseline information so that it can perform its analysis. So you can see some examples here. Know how to connect the 365 connector, know how to connect the Defender for Cloud connector. They're fairly linear in how you create them, but I would spend some time going through establishing those connectors.
So a great point he makes here is that fact that these are going to be core. So I think he's giving a little hint here in the secret sauce, and the fact that you'll need to know how to connect and configure at least, at minimum, these two core Microsoft Defender connectors, right? And so you could absolutely see a question on the test with like a put in order the steps, right? So you may have, apply changes, select Microsoft 365 Defender, select data connectors, right? You got to put the steps in order. Which step is first, which step is second, etc. Or hey, I need to deploy the Microsoft 365 Defender connector. What do I need to do first, right? Select data connectors, right? Or what is the last step of connecting the Microsoft Defender for Cloud connector? We'll select the bidirectional sync as the last step, right? So knowing these steps that you're supposed to go through is core to the test, right? Especially at the associate level, they're going to ask you questions like that.
So you understand what's available to you in each. In addition, if we have non-Defender based data, if we have, for example, Syslog information that we want to stream from Linux-based machines that support Sentinel, there's an agent for Linux that we can deploy to stream that data directly. So we can design and configure both Syslog and CEF connectors for that purpose. So for the Syslog connector, it'll be in your data connectors page. It'll give you the install steps for an Azure Linux machine and for other Linux machines. You'll then configure whatever Syslog facilities you want collected from that. If you're pulling in data that's common event format data, then your process can be one of two ways. You can either use an on-prem forwarder or you can use a cloud-based forwarder. In the first example, you see you're setting up a Linux VM in Azure that's going to collect data from your on-prem resources securely, and then pass that information into Sentinel through the Log Analytics agent running on that machine. In the second example, you have an on-prem server that runs the Log Analytics agent, or an on-prem Syslog forwarder, that runs the Log Analytics agent. It's going to connect securely.
Alright guys, let's continue taking a look. As you see, I got a little change of scenery in. It's a little later in the day and I'm down in the wife's office. But let's keep taking a look through the video, and we're going to continue on connecting and configuring Syslog and the common event format event collections.
To Azure over port 443.
Let's rewind it just a little bit.
It's going to collect data from your on-prem resources securely, and then pass that information into Sentinel through the Log Analytics agent running on that machine. In the second example, you have an on-prem server that runs the Log Analytics agent, or an on-prem Syslog forwarder, that runs the Log Analytics agent. It's going to connect securely to Azure over port 443. The process is very similar. It's just what best suits your needs. The important distinction to note here for the exam is that you can do both. And think of scenarios where you might need to do one versus the other. When do you want to leverage an Azure managed virtual machine? When might it be more beneficial for you to use an on-prem virtual machine to secure that connection? Both work. Okay, you get the option to do both, but know and understand how to configure both, and then also the implications of doing one versus the other. If you're going to connect Windows security events, very similar to what we saw when we connected CEF events, we've got two different ways of doing it. We can install an agent on each Windows device, have them forward those events to Sentinel. In this case, you'll use AMA connector, and the legacy agent will send that, or legacy agent connector will send that information to your environment. Use those either of those two agents in that case. Or you can configure a service. You can configure an event collector device, have that device receive forwarded events, and then have those forwarded events sent to Sentinel. So obviously what we want to look at is, all right, what's the benefits? Which one do I want to use versus the other? If I use security events via AMA connector versus the legacy connector, remember the AMA connector can manage settings for scale, connect a monitoring agent, share with other solutions, better security, better performance, but it's not compatible with Defender for Cloud. So there are always factors, and these are the kind of things that you want to go back and review. The test will formulate questions to help you or to lead you into making decisions about which of these options you should choose.
So here, you can tell that the instructor is really leaning on you to understand that the test questions are going to point you in the direction of the right solution, right? So for example, here, we're going to need to know when would we configure the Windows Event Collector device service versus when we would use the legacy agent connector or the AMA agent connector. That's very important distinctions, and so we'll double down on those tomorrow.
And they'll present you with a case where you'll have to understand the ramifications of choosing one versus the other. So, as I said, that's an area you want to review. So review the configurations. More importantly, review why you would choose one configuration versus another. Now, there are other sources potentially for evaluating information, and we want Sentinel to be as broad as possible. So let's talk about how we can associate this with threat intelligence. So we can configure threat intelligence connectors in Sentinel as well. So we can connect Sentinel to other threat intelligence platforms you might have, Threat Connect, MyMeld, MISP, or any other integrated connections you might have. For the exam, you want to understand that Sentinel doesn't exist monolithically. It does have connection points into those other environments. They walk you through the steps here on this slide of registering an application in Azure AD, so it gets recognized. You get an app ID and an app secret and the tenant ID associated with it. Then going in and configuring security for that registered application. We'll then go ahead and get consent to register the application for the organization, configure your threat intelligence product then using Microsoft Graph threat indicators to send to securely connect to Microsoft Sentinel. And then in Sentinel, you can configure your data connectors with that platform connector, the TIP connector. We'll then go into the connector page, connect, provide the information from Azure Active Directory, and then you'll be able to ingest that information from your threat intelligence platform with Sentinel.
So here I can see a very easy question, such as Microsoft saying, what permission does threat intelligence or what permission do threat intelligence connectors need on their app registration, right? And so, for instance, for this one, you need to understand that you're going to be configuring the threat indicators read-write permission, right? So I can very easily have them list out permissions, and you have to select which one is the right one. So you have to remember it's the threat indicators read and write.
The main thing is to know that the capacity exists. Sentinel is designed to be a holistic product, to be able to cover multiple uh, ingestion points for threat analysis. And TIP solutions are just another one. So if we can do all that means that we've got all of these streams of information flowing into log analytics. So the point was to be able to evaluate and analyze them. So the next thing we want to look at is that analysis part. A lot of this will come from analytics rules. You can use Sentinel analytics rules to inform what notifications and alerts you get based on the data that comes in. It's important to know the 6 types of analytic rules that you have available to you. Anomaly rules, which something that is out of the ordinary. Azure Machine Learning will be able to evaluate behavior over time and set up or detect anomalous behavior. Fusion rules are when we're looking at rules across different axes. You may have a number of kind of low impact looking alerts, but when taken together, you recognize that they're part of a multi-stage attack in your environment. Microsoft security alerts are kind of self-explanatory. They're going to come from the Microsoft Security Service. Machine learning behavioral analytics are the core of how we evaluate all that. Scheduled alerts. We may have scheduled analytics rules that run periodically. And then near real-time evaluation. The NRT rules we use to kind of govern near real-time evaluation. There's a limited set of those based on scheduled rules. They run usually once every 60 seconds to give you information that's as up-to-date as possible. That's why it's near real-time, not real-time. So understand how to create an analytics rule, the create rule button, define the code that underpins the rule logic, and then specify what responses you want. You can do it either from templates or from a wizard. Certainly understand what the basic platform logic is for an analytic rule, know how to build one, and know that you can modify existing or edit existing rules. The 4 actions they list there for managing existing analytic rules are edit, disable, duplicate, and delete. Know those capabilities and know that that's available to you as options. So when you load connectors, you will often get rule types available to you. What we want to be able to do is know how to enable or activate analytic rules. So in your preparation, go back into Sentinel Analytics and go into your active rules. Look for here under status, identifying the rules that are enabled. Remember, the rule types we just went over will be listed here. And then you can select a rule, right? And then from that rule, you will get the details of it. It'll specify what its severity is, what its status is. And if you want to go in and edit or make changes to that rule, that edit option is there. So you see the enable and disable options here on the menu. You also see the delete option here. There's an import and export. All of those tools are right here in the analytics section of Sentinel. So be comfortable with that. Know and understand how to navigate around the analytics rules.
So real quick, we'll go in and we'll take a look. So let's take a look at Microsoft Sentinel, analytics rules. So we go in under our configuration for analytics. So we have 4 active rule types. We can remove that out. We can see which ones we have enabled. Right, so we can sort them by the name. You can sort them by severity if you want, but you can see the rule type as he was talking about, right? So we have 4 different rules. We have a malicious inbox rule. We have sign-ins from IT attempts, sign-ins to disabled accounts. We have a solar gate network beacon, advanced multi-stage attack detection, which is fusion rule. Gallery content tells you where the sources are coming from. All right, so let's take a look. This malicious inbox rule. We can edit, we can rule runs, preview. We can edit the rules. You can see what it is. You can see the tactics that's using by hovering over the information. Sometimes it's a defense evasion. It's a tactic. So there's lots of tactics on this fusion rule, multi-stage attack, right? In multiple stages. So pretty slick, pretty quick and easy. Nothing too crazy. You can also see all the different rule templates you have. You have to choose from, the anomalies. Lots of craziness going on there. But right now we have 4 enabled on our workspace.
So these are ultimately going to be based on queries. So let's go back and let's think again about queries and how queries relate to our environment. The hunting page in Sentinel is where you're going to find all the queries associated with your connectors. Is also where, as we'll talk toward the end of this section, as you start going into advanced hunting, you can go and start authoring your own. But your hunting environment is going to be here. And you'll see your queries, any live streams, and any bookmarks, which we'll talk about later, that you have created. Notice that they are categorized once again around the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And you can see then how these queries are going to be classified. You'll see the queries themselves, where they come from, what their data sources are, any results that have occurred. And then, as I mentioned over here in the far column, you'll see the MITRE ATT&CK tactics that are used with that query. So when we start building our own, we're going to have to supply all that data too. Now, the best way to learn query and query structure is to look at queries. So one of the test strategies I always recommend to students for this exam is look at the queries that are already there. Get familiar with kind of the foundational structure behind those queries, so that then when you start needing to configure and customize queries, you sort of know or have some examples of what that rule logic is. Okay, so know how to create a scheduled query rule. Whenever we want to do any analytics, let's say we're given a scenario in the exam where there's an application and we know we want to analyze certain things about that application, we can go in and have and create a query that looks at that. So once again, we're probably not going to have to write out the query. They'll probably give us the framework of it and ask us to fill in the gaps. But we want to know from an implementation standpoint that we can then go into query scheduling and define how we want that query to run. So understand how we create the queries themselves, understand how we use scheduled queries as the basis of analysis. These things all tie together. So understanding one part of it, you want to understand it in relationship to the others. So how do we define that logic? Well, to create an incident based on information we need a query for that. So here we're creating analytics rule for analytics rule wizard. On the set rule logic tab is where we'll have to define the KQL for that. So if I zoom in here, you can see we're in the analytics rule wizard and we're creating a new rule. We've given it general information. We're now here in setting the rule logic. And this is where we're going to define the KQL that's associated with that logic. So understanding fundamental KQL, understanding any custom entity mappings that we want to perform, this gives us the platform to build that rule logic out. We want to always test that by using the view query results link here to test that. You'll also be able to test it with current data, and you want to, especially if you know what the results are anticipated to be, verify that those results match. You may want to tweak this. Now, creating rule logic is the general, but often we're creating this in response to something specific. We had a threat that has manifested itself against our executive workstations, or we have a threat to our financial services team. How can we create more targeted evaluations based around those things? Well, one of the tools we can use is something called a watch list. A watch list is a way of creating and collecting kind of external information that we can then use within searches, we can use in detection rules, we can use in threat hunting, we can use in response playbooks. So I can create, in a sense, a name value pair of laptop information. That's a common one that I've seen used before. And we want to create a specific analytic rule that targets that watch list. So this means that A, I don't get unnecessary alerts because I only get alerts related to that group of machines. B, when I do reporting, I can do reporting or querying based on that group of machines. When I'm searching for things, I can search based on that group of machines. It's a way of expanding this environment. So you can create a watch list. You can usually you'll update the watch list, edit the items, and then add new ones. There's a bulk update option where you can bring in data from like a CSV or something like that. But think about scenarios around subsets of a larger population. Those are the kind of things that show up on the exam. I want to create a detection for a subgroup of a larger group, and what's the best way to implement that? So all of this is talking about.
Let's take a look at that real quick, right? So what's basically saying is we want to segment, right? So a lot of people that are going to start taking this test are going to be coming from a networking background or some sort of IT help desk background. We want to segment our data, right? So we want to segment our user base, for example. We want to segment our workstation base, as they're saying, our computer base, whatever, right? So we want to take all the alerts for that subset of data and then watch that only, right? Kind of create a higher tier. So let's go into Sentinel and let's go ahead and take a look at how we would do it real quick. So let's see, right? We're once again in our Sentinel workspace. It's under configuration. We go to watch lists, right? We have our one logged watch list right now for log4j. We can click it, right? We can either view in logs. We can edit it, right? So what we could do, we could add new, we could update the watch list, right? Edit watch list items, right? And you can add new. And so I'm looking for all these different items on my watch list, right? So these are just exploits. I could add a whole new list if I want to. Very simple. Add another row, keep it moving, right? But you can also add a new watch list, etc. if you want to. So this is just looking for certain log4j data. But you should be comfortable with saying, hey, if I wanted to go update a watch list, how would you do it? You would go to Microsoft Sentinel, configuration, watch list, click it, click your watch list, right click, right? You can either update watch list, edit watch list, or bulk update with a CSV file. You can also do templates, right? They have certain templates already in there for network addresses, service accounts, high value assets, identity correlation, terminated employees, etc. Right? So I would be very comfortable with knowing each one of those. Let's keep it rolling.
How to manage the information that we get. How do I create the threat analytics piece with the underlying queries that are a part of it? and then using watch lists to further truncate or evaluate that criteria. Now, another piece of this puzzle is this idea of threat indicators. Think about being able to sort, filter, search information without having to write a query for it, without having to look for queryable data. One of the ways we can do that is in Sentinel, there's a threat intelligence section. And from there, you can add threat indicators. One of the things that we do with threat indicators is we can create tags. Tagging allows indicators to associate things with a common event or actor or attack campaign. So let's say in the question they're talking about, there's a known group of files that, if they are present, represent a precursor to a data exfiltration attempt. We can then sort of tag those around a common identity and then use that common identity to associate all those individual alerts or actions within a larger campaign. So it's one of the common practices you'll have is to create a naming convention that you use around those threat indicators based on your SOC policy. From an exam standpoint, what we want to do is we want to recognize that we can tag threat indicators and that we can then use that tagging to group things into a larger context. The steps for doing that, you'll create the new threat indicators and then tag things with that indicator to indicate they're part of a larger campaign.
So let's take a look at how to do that real quick, right? I'm not going to take a look at everything as we do it, but just certain things where it's rare that we'll probably do it unless we do it here in the study prep, right? So we don't often create that threat indicators. Let's go through and show you how to do it real quick. So once again, we're in Microsoft Sentinel, right? Let's see if we can find it under threat management, right? So we have instance, workbooks, hunting, threat intelligence. It's going to be under threat intelligence. Right, we don't have any TI indicators, nothing for TI alerts. We can import, right? We can add new, add a type, right? Domain name, URL, right? File, IP address, wherever we want. We could then say, hey, we want a URL, right? We have to put in the URL. We add tags to it, what the threat type is, the description, the name, revoked, confidence, kill chain. Then we can put what's called validity dates, right? So we can say, hey, we entered it today, August 20th. We want it to be valid for 6 months, right? So then we're going to expire this, February 20th of 2024. Apply it, and then we'll roll. Super simple, but I think for the purpose of the test, we just need to know, hey, it's under threat management. You can add new, right? And then you can also import, right, from a file. We can import using TI solutions. So I think that's really important to know, hey, what TI solutions are you going to use, right? What the plans are, right? How we can use it, etc. Super straightforward, nothing crazy. Very simple to put into use. All right, let's keep going.
Now, the third part of that is classifying and analyzing that information. Analyzing that information comes from the Advanced Security Information Model, or ASIM. And what that does is it allows me to take information coming from multiple data sources. Remember, we talked about one of the strengths of Sentinel is being able to connect it to multiple things. The challenge with that is how do we get the data to then be relatable? That's that idea of data normalization. So we have to come up with some way to get that data to be framed consistently, so that when we bring it into Sentinel, it can analyze it properly. So we talk about like certain schemas will be normalized, like CEF format. But if we have non-normalized data, what we could do is we can create something called a parser. Understand what parsers are and what they do, and how parsers map data into a unified normalized data frame. So it's important to map or to have parsers that can do that kind of underlying normalization. Once we do that, now Sentinel's analytics can help us. So as an exam taker, I want to understand parsers. Be sure you review parsers and you know what they do as far as the ingestion process here, and understand how all this relates to the advanced security information block. Note that you can create custom logs in Sentinel, and we can use Log Analytics, the Log Analytics agent, to parse that data into Sentinel using any one of our custom log formats. Now, there's some specific steps you have to take into account. You want to make sure you understand this logic. That first of all, you need the Log Analytics agent because you need something to generate the log. You'll then need to configure the Log Analytics agent to gather that log data. Now, there might be some other instructions necessary. That's going to depend upon what log collection you want to do. And then you're going to configure the Log Analytics agent in Sentinel. But remember, this is customized information. So you're going to need custom tables, record delimiters, and so on, something that tells Sentinel what this data is and how to use it. Very much following the same logic flow from parsers and normalizing data. We want to use the custom capabilities to be able to store custom data, but we need to make sure we have the appropriate configuration for the connector to be able to do it. So now that we've gotten that kind of customized information, how do we query that data? How do we use those parsers that we talked about for normalizing data to provide an easier way to extract that information out? What we can do is we can look at the parsers that we've created. And one of the nice things that you can do with the incident event management is that we can use those parsers instead of having to understand the underlying table names in our queries. We can just query the parser. Remember, the parser's job is to take the data and normalize it and make it and provide a way of accessing it. So if I know the name or identity of that parser, I can use that parser to pull that information in. There are unifying and source-specific parsers. Unifying parsers combine all the sources, normalize to the same schema, then query them using normalized. So that's probably the best and fastest way to get normalized data evaluated by Sentinel's SIEM functionality. So if you know the parser identities, you can query those. That's something you want to understand for the exam. Understand how parsers work and what their role is in ingesting and normalizing data in the Sentinel. This is a workflow that we use to kind of look at how to create a custom parser. So clearly that parser is going to require log data. You'll need to figure out the schema or structure that the events sent from that source represent. You'll then map those fields to the identified schema or schemas where the source events are coming from, and then create parsers for that. You want to test that, make sure it works. Deploy those parsers then to Sentinel, update the unifying parser that consolidates that data with the new custom parser that you created for this data source. Now, it says you might want to contribute your parsers to the primary ASIM distribution so that other people have availability to it. Think about this, again, in the context of an exam. Do I know this workflow? So if I was presented with a scenario where I needed to build a parser and they asked me to create or construct the steps to do it, could I repeat those? That's the kind of thing that you might see on the exam.
What you just said there was so important. Like, he's breaking down some really good tips on the exam, right? He's saying, hey, you may not have to build your own parser on the exam, but you very well could be asked to design the steps and reprocess the workflow, right? So, hey, put these steps in order, right? Collect sample logs, identify the schema, map the source event fields, right? Or, hey, what are the last three steps in deploying and managing the ASIM parser, right? Deploy the parser into the workspace, update the relevant ASIM parser to reference the new custom parser, right? And then you may upload that new parser into the primary ASIM distribution, right? Super important to know that. So we're about halfway through, so let's keep motoring.
Understand that this normalization of information is all a part of creating this analytic tool that Sentinel can use. We're ingesting data from different unstructured data sources. Then we need to make sure that Sentinel structure is consistent across them. What I mean by that is that I've got data coming in a variety of different formats. I need something to take that data to create a normal form that I can then use a consistent analytic model against. Now that we have ingested information, we want to create some automated responses to those. There are really three levels of automation that we can configure. If you go into Sentinel and go into automation, you will see that there's an automation rule, a playbook with an incident trigger, a playbook with an alert trigger. There's a blank playbook here, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the automation rule is probably the simplest of those. You can think of it as kind of an if-then statement. And if you look at the conditional logic here, you'll see it has a name, a trigger, and then an if statement. If a rule contains or has or whatever conditional action we want to have, or condition we want to meet, we then specify an action that we want to take place. Very straightforward, very simple. If this, then this. So fundamentally, our base level of automation is going to be defined by that. Now, if we want to get more complicated, we can create something called a playbook. A playbook is a more involved automation mechanism. It can be more complex. It can have branching logic for that. It uses the Azure Logic Apps designer. So when we talk about a Sentinel playbook, what we're talking about is an Azure Logic app, which is our foundational tool for automation. So you create a playbook, and as you saw, you can create a playbook with a trigger, or you create a blank playbook. You'll then specify an incident and what actions you want associated with it. You can then go into threat management, find that incident, and then associate or tie a given playbook with it. Remember that playbooks are your automation guide. Some playbooks may get loaded when you bring in a particular data connector, but key to this is that you can author your own. Playbooks always equal automation. So if you understand the automation mechanism piece, you'll understand how playbooks fit into that. So review that. Specifically, how do we configure the triggers for playbooks? As you saw, there are two kinds of triggers. There's incidents and alerts. Fundamentally, we know that alerts or groups of alerts are what we can use to inform an incident. But we can configure the automation at the incident level, or we can configure it for a specific alert. Now, that's going to be based on what level or what kind of automation you want to perform. Understanding that you, as the analyst designing this automation strategy, have that ability to set your automation at either of those levels. That's going to be important. So this is what I want to think about and how I want to approach automation. Understanding that I can do this as an incident function or as an alert function. The thing to remember about your playbooks is you can create your playbook, define the trigger, set the conditions, and what actions and outputs it'll produce. You get to set the criteria. Do you want to respond to incidents and alerts? Do you want to run it on demand on incidents and alerts? That's going to be completely up to you. Know for the exam that you have both those options on the table. Even though the playbook itself is an automated response to an action, its trigger does not have to be some specific event. You could set the playbook to run when the event or incident occurs, but then require someone to actually initiate it. It doesn't have to run automatically. That's an important distinction to know for the exam, but you have that option. That even though a playbook is I burped in the middle of that sentence, so let me start that. Don't want that on the recording. Okay, so we use playbooks to remediate threat, but you can use the automated capability of playbooks manually. And I know that sounds weird, but think about it. If you have a playbook that runs a response to a trigger, do you want it to run immediately when that triggering incident occurs? Or do you want it to generate the incident and then someone be able to go in the incident and hit something that then kicks off a playbook that responds?
So think about this, right? Their bottom example in this scenario or in this question is really what I want to focus on, especially for the exam, right? Like we would use the on-demand playbook, right, for situations where we want a human to say, yes, let's run this playbook. Yes, this is a real incident, right? It's not a fake, like it's not false, right? It's a real incident. We want to go ahead and take actions, but we don't want to take those actions manually, right? We don't want to go look up and look into a run book that we might have written down on a OneNote somewhere. We have it, like we know the examples that we're going to go close off, what we're going to do. We've just validated that yes, this is a real incident. Let's take actions.
To that incident. You have both those options. So thinking about the ability to do both of those when it comes to the exam is important. You'll be able to see that in question. Like you'll get possibly a question about what are the options available to an operator when this occurs. So know that you can configure that at either of those levels. So how can we use this to kind of manage incidents? Well, that's the next level. So if we got an incident that, for example, said that a user account was compromised, well, we don't want to wait. We want to do something to kind of mitigate that potential threat. This is how we can walk through a process of using this automation to manage an incident. So if you walk through the steps here, you create a playbook that does the following actions. The playbook is called by an automation rule, passing it an incident. The playbook then opens a ticket. It sends a message to your SOC channel to ensure that your analysts are aware of the incident, for in Teams, for example. It also sends all the information, the incident, in an email message to your network admins. And the message will include options to block or ignore. The playbook waits until it gets that block or ignore request or response before it does what's next. If you choose block, it then goes into Azure Active Directory, disables the user, and went to the firewall to block the IP address. If it's ignore, it closes the incident and sends a ticket to something like ServiceNow. So that's the level of capacity that you have. Understand that scope. So
Think about that. You can take this playbook, right, and integrate it with tools and platforms throughout your entire organization, right? So a playbook is started, right? It's an automation that starts, right? Opens up a ticket in ServiceNow, sends a message to your SecOps team, right? Running completely out of Teams, Slack, whatever you want, right? And then sends all the information over via email. Also, you could keep all the information just in Slack if you want, right? And it'll include in the options, right? You can either block and ignore. So say maybe you got that action for a user that you know we need to block this, right? Or hey, this isn't real, right? It's fake. The user's logging in from a VPN, etc., whatever, right? You can ignore or you can block. Playbook waits, gets a response, goes to the next step. If it says block, sends a command, right, to disable the user, block the firewall, whatever, right? The admins choose ignore, right? Playbook closes the incident, Microsoft Sentinel, ticket, etc. Right? All that is very important to know, and just know like that's just the continuous amount of integrations that you can take with Microsoft Sentinel.
for the exam, the picture that we want to paint is that we can take steps in a process, create a workflow, store that workflow, and then in a playbook, and then determine what events cause that playbook to run or parts of that playbook to run. You notice here, there's branching logic within that response string of the playbook as to what it does based on the response to an email. So What we want to do is then say, all right, well, if I've got all this capacity, how do I know what to do where? Well, from the old medical idea of triage, of being able to rank and evaluate threats. What we want to be able to do is investigate it. Incidents may look innocuous, but upon further investigation, we find they are quite serious. So understand how to find or how to perform investigations within the incident details. So within an incident, you can pull up the details of that incident by selecting the incident and then clicking on the investigate button on the incident details page. What that investigation will show you are the related graphical representations of that suspected incident. So what you see is you'll see the analytics rule from the rule list. You'll see the response from the impacted resources. You'll see those about. You'll see what occurred. You'll see any impacted endpoints or files or users or network settings. You'll get all of that information. This scenario shows how to create like an analytics rule for deleting a deletion of a VM and then investigate it. So they create the rule that looks for VM deletion. You could then create a test VM, delete it, and then look at the entity book. It would show you the information I was saying. The VM that was affected, the user that did it, where they came from, all of it. So remember, part of effective analysis and part of what we're going to try to illustrate on the exam is how do you not just know how things work, but how do you evaluate how you test against them? And it's very important to see. So once I've tested and I know that I have rules in place that can help me investigate incidents, how can I respond to incidents? So I've got these rules. These rules are like my sensors that I've tuned to look for things. Well, what happens when they find something? Every incident you find in Sentinel has some associated metadata with it. New security events have a new status, as you can change the status as you see fit. You can review the severity. Remember the 4 severity levels: high, medium, low, informational. Those are classified internally, but you can always adjust them based on their relative importance to you. One of the big things you want to know is how to assign ownership of an incident. Making sure that someone has overall management of that incident can impact who gets notifications, what capability they have, who can do status updates. Now you can change ownership at any time to illustrate like escalation or something like that, but this is a part of that process for managing or responding to the incidents that occur. So this is all fine when you're working in one Sentinel workspace. What happens if you have events across multiple workspaces? How can we incorporate that? Well, especially when it comes to the exam, you want to be able to understand how to view Sentinel data across multiple workstations if possible. Now notice that multi-workspace view is only available incidents, not alerts. It looks like the regular incidents page, but what it'll do is at the top of the page, it'll show open incidents and the numbers for all the selected workspaces collectively. If you want to see incidents from an individual workspace, you can filter the list using the filter options that you see here. Okay. So you can add a filter to filter those options if necessary. Note that you need read-write permissions on all the workspaces from which you have selected incidents in order to see them. That is an important identifier for the exam. Why question? Why can't someone see something? Understanding what permissions you need in order to be able to view something is important for you to be able to answer those kind of questions on the exam. If you choose a single incident and click View Full Details or Actions Investigate, you'll be in the data context of that specific incident's workspace. You'll see it within the context of the individual workspace, but note that you have the ability to view across multiple workspaces, provided you have multiple credentials.
Listen to the tip he is giving here. And this goes through any of the Microsoft exams, outside of mainly the fundamentals. But knowing the roles and permissions is critical. Microsoft asks so many wordy questions around what actions you can take on which roles. Like he said, why can't this person see this, right? Well, they probably don't have the reader role to that workspace, right? Or hey, what could you enable to help this person see, right? All those kind of questions always come up, and very annoying. Usually it's like question 35 and you're halfway through the test and you just want to get it over with. So yeah.
Now, you won't have Azure Lighthouse questions on the exam, so you won't have to worry about integrating Lighthouse into this solution. All right, so we've looked at investigation of incidents. We've looked at investigating multi-workspace incidents. One of the key triggers for any kind of anomalous detection is understanding or evaluating the behavior of things, entities. So what does Azure have in this space with Sentinel? Well, one of the things we have is something called entity behavior analytics. And the behavior is the ability for us to be able to look at information and give what I would call actionable intelligence. What we want people to do is be able to focus their time on the most relevant threats. So by enabling entity behavior analytics, the UEBA engine, it allows you to be able to effectively evaluate information across your environment. It looks for anomalous behavior, but also takes into account its ability to learn behaviors over time. So although things may look strange, if it's strange repeatedly over time for your organization, it will learn that. It'll figure out relative sensitivity of assets, and it'll look at the impact of that compromise. So based on what it sees, it's able to do evaluation for that. Now, this requires you to enable entity behavior analytics to understand how to do that, and then note the ramifications of doing that in your enterprise. All right. Now, when we started this section, we talked about the core goal of Sentinel, which was analysis. When you start loading data connectors, most of the connectors that you load will have built into them analytic mechanisms. You can kind of think of them as customizable views of the information that you find in Sentinel. So what we use, or what we call those, are workbooks. Workbooks are that tool that we use to be able to provide that kind of dynamic evaluation. So now for our common connectors, we already have this. But as we start building customized connections, we want to know how to be able to build our own. So with many things you've seen in Sentinel and just in Azure in general, there are templates that you can use. So you can use the Sentinel workbook templates to build these custom workbook operations. You can see what you'll see when you start going into the My Workbooks tab. And this is where you can build your own. There's an advanced editor where you can do even further customization. But the key is being able to establish or create customized workbooks on our own. So to create a custom workbook, let's say we have an application or a workflow, and we need to view information in Sentinel around number of users, active users, longest running connection, dropped connections, faults generated, and so on. Well, we'll need obviously analysis queries, query items to run that. We'll need visualization, something to visualize that information. We may include parameters for how this workbook interacts with or manipulates query parameters like drop downs or options or so on. We can add links or tabs to customize the navigation. We can create metric steps, so what to do with the metrics from this, incorporate them into different Azure resources, and so on. This is really a programmatic device. And understanding that the workbooks inform how Sentinel is able to manage the data. Often you'll hear them referred to as the dashboards of Sentinel for a given connector. A lot of that's true because they provide that way of viewing the information that's raw ingested through the connector. So take some time to go through building a workbook. There are a number of tutorials you can use to kind of help with that and build a workbook solution. So it's important to understand what workbooks do and the role they serve within Sentinel. If we want to do some more advanced things, we can go in and edit the visualizations. We can create specific time ranges. We can create a drop-down menu to filter records based on the user or service that generates them as the caller function. We can create a drop-down menu to filter events based on a resource group. We can display activities run by users or security principals. And there's even an edit function here. Now remember, this is all part of what we can do within the global idea of a workbook. A workbook is the ultimate tool for describing how we're going to process the information from the Sentinel. And for the exam, you want to know that. We're showing you here some of the different capabilities of workbooks. So when you're preparing, you know what to look at, what to focus on when it talks about workbooks. It's a big topic. So these are the areas from the SC-200 exam that are going to be most relevant when you talk about workbook design. How do you use the data in a workbook? So here's where analyzing the logs from Azure Activity comes into play. Here, you can go to Azure Activity, you can view data, and then as we see here, you will form your query based on that table. So coming from Azure Activity, that's the query we're running, looking at the information that we want to collect through this workbook. So ultimately, your workbook provides the platform for being able to view and manage information that comes into Sentinel. Now, note that every time you create or update an incident, there's always going to be a new log entry generated to something called the security incidents table. So whenever there are changes made to incidents, this gives you even more kind of, if you think about it, analysis capability. What we want to understand about the security operations efficiency workbook is that it's an enhancement to or gives us metrics above and beyond what our workbooks show us. It is more broadly based on certain security incidents over time. Incidents created, incidents closed, incident severity, incident owner, time to triage, time to closure, incidents created by severity, owner, status, product, time to closure percentile, recent activities, recent closing classifications, all of that metadata about things that have happened in your space are shown here in the Security Operations Efficiency Workbook. So remember that not just the data that comes into workbooks associated with your connectors is available for you from an analytical standpoint, but you have that data about security events kind of in the mean as well. Finally, we want to not only be able to view information, but also perform our own analysis and our own forensic investigations. This is where the idea of hunting or threat hunting and hunting queries comes in. Because what we're able to do is we're able to use the data that's in this large repository. Remember, what Sentinel ultimately is is a log analytics workspace, and that's just a data repository that has information that we can query on our own. So even though our workbooks are going to provide us with sort of this platform capacity to be able to view and show information, we also want to be able to go in and do things on our own. So being able to create our own queries is going to be helpful for that. Now there's going to be pre-generated queries, and we can go in and look at those, modify those, look at the details of those, and run those. But we also want to be able to create our own queries using KQL. So as we start thinking about what we're going to do in the workspace, creating our own queries using KQL is going to be important. So how can I run these? How can I run these manually? Well, you can go into the threat hunting and select run query in the hunting queries page. And then you can run your queries directly from there. Whatever matches gets displayed in the table, in the results column, and you can see what the response would have happened. So when would you do that? Before an incident occurs, to take proactive action. During a compromise, we can use the live stream capability to get it run periodically, or after a compromise as kind of a forensic or a post-mortem. So knowing and understanding those different use cases, usually it's pretty clear how to do it after. Something has happened, we want to run a query against things to find out what happened.
So think about that, right? If we can take a pause right there, we can say, hey, we are trying to take proactive action, right? We want to try to hunt for certain data across our entire log analytics workspace, right? Cool, that's whatever. But during a live incident where a machine is infected with whatever, we can also take that infection and then run that against our entire rest of our organization's infrastructure. Right? Does it see it anywhere, right? We found a fault in a Mac OS device or a Linux device. Check all of our Linux devices against that, whatever it saw, right? We can then check that anywhere as long as that device is in data is ingested in a Sentinel. We now have access to all of that data, right? So that's the power of Sentinel, right? At the end of the day, like the instructor's saying, it's logs at the end of the day, right? Logs and retention, and we have the power now to take action and visualize that data, right, in just different ways. Sentinel creates the incidents, etc., right? He's talking about how the connectors have their own built-in workbooks, playbooks, etc., right? Their own threat detection rules, but we can create our own, right? Your mind is the greatest, right?
We can kind of think a little bit about what happens before, like using this investigatively because we suspect it. But one of the neat things we can do is something called live stream, which is where we can run a query constantly so that we can stream results into the environment as they come. We can create live stream sessions to test things and view data, get notifications as they come in. We use this to create, like I said, an interactive session against an environment. So one of the first things you'll do is you'll go into your query and you'll say you want to create a live stream session. And when you do that, you can use that data coming into view in near real time what's going on in a specific entity. As you run that query and events that match it happen, you'll get notifications from those sessions. And then from there, we can use our investigative mechanisms to do a deep dive if necessary. So you can see you'll create the session, you'll be able to get notifications within that session, and then elevate those to an alert if you detect an indicator of compromise. So think about we suspect someone is tracking, or better yet, here's a better example. We suspect a bad actor, so we've created like a little honeypot, something that we want to stage to try to catch the attacker. Well, we might establish a live stream session with that honeypot resource, looking for those indicators of compromise. And then when they occur, we get a notification, boop, and then we can begin our investigation, begin our remediations, start tracking the progress of that attack or incident. So the neat part about this is that all of these different elements kind of exist as individual elements, but we can also consolidate them into investigation and hunting objects that we call notebooks. There's a couple of different ways we can use notebooks. There's something called Mystic Pi, or Microsoft Threat Intelligence Python security tool. It's a set of tools that are intended for you to be able to use in security investigations and hunting. If you're familiar with Jupyter notebooks that we use to solve specific problems, a lot of what we find in these Microsoft Threat Intelligence Python security tools are derived from that. And ideally, they are built around three axes: acquiring and enriching data, analyzing data, and visualizing data. What you want to know is how to onboard these. Understand how to onboard these notebooks into your environment. Now, these threat intelligence Python security tools can use KQL, and there are predefined queries for Sentinel, 365 Defender, and the Microsoft Security Graph. So how can we do hunting using these notebooks? Well, we can take these notebooks and or Jupyter notebooks and create and share things that, for example, have code or visualizations or explanatory text or equations or anything like that that we might want to incorporate into a hunting environment. The notebook allows me to create this and also share this information along with all that other data. In this example, you could see, for example, there's a geo-mapping of external IP addresses connecting with a host. You can see here a timeline of network flows across that architecture. So we can incorporate all that into a single element. Instead of having to create different hunting queries and different components, we can take all that, collapse it into a single notebook, and then pass that on as a singular architecture.
So real quick, think about how cool that is, right? So we've taken now all the tools and resources, right? This is very advanced. This is like advanced threat hunting to the nth degree, right? This is your tier 3. This is your threat hunters of the world, right? These are the people that are going to go do a post-mortem, for example, right? They're going to take all those incidents, right, and put them into a notebook and then build it, right? So they've actually shown here, right, a geolocation mapping for external IPs, right? Where that, like, they've, location markers are tagged, right? Where from the outbound is going, the inbound, right? So we have, say, a honeypot, like he used for example, right? We have attackers trying to attack the honeypot. This is where all the IPs are coming from, trying to attack that, our honeypot source, right? And where the outbound is then trying to take it to, right? Where's the command and control center, for example. So there's very cool ways we can wrap it all up into one pretty little area.
Forensic hunter, or as someone that's doing an investigation across my environment, I may note things from time to time that was interesting. So I run a query against an incident. That's interesting. I want to note that. What we can do with results is create bookmarks. Bookmarks allow us to in a sense, flag events and ultimately collate them. The bookmark functionality allows us to bookmark query results. So we run the query and we know the query logic, but we want to keep these results. Maybe there was something interesting in the result set there. So you may get a question where there's a result set and you want to be able to correlate this result set with another query you may run later. By bookmarking those result set allows you to save them, in a sense, keep them available to you. Note if a bookmark query, it says here, this is important, captures results from a hunting query, it automatically inherits the query's MITRE ATT&CK technique and entity mappings. So that's helpful. So if we tie that in with now using hunting bookmarks, we can get a larger picture of the environment as a whole. So by using bookmarks in Sentinel, we can hunt for threats utilizing queries that we ran in Sentinel, along with the query results in the current context that you deem relevant. So remember, if you think about basic database architecture, you run a query, You run another query, those original results kind of go away. What we want to do with bookmarks is we create that kind of contextual record of our observations, and then we can add notes and tags to those operations. We can build a new incident from a bookmark. We can add bookmark query results to other incidents. And we can use that to help create visual representations of those actions. So for example, here I could go into a bookmark, and for example, I could create a new incident from that, or I could add that query result to an existing incident. Know that this capability exists. This is all a part of me being able to see or view or evaluate how I process this information in total. So if I'm going to use hunting queries to find things, what happens if the thing I find represents or is associated with an ongoing environmental condition that I want to be notified? What if I want this to, if I'm using this in, say, a live stream session, and now I realize, hey, I want to turn this into some sort of more permanent alert within Sentinel. Within your live stream session, you will find, and you can see it here, I'll zoom in just so you can see even more clearly, this elevate to alert operator. The elevate to alert operator allows you to promote a live stream session, which is basically just notifications about positive results to a query, to an actual alert. And then you can convert the hunting query to an analytic rule that we use to process this. So think about that. Think about you wrote a query to look for something. Okay. Now you want what you've looked for to be permanent, to always look for that. Okay, now I can create in a sense, an analytic rule from that same hunting query just by using the elevate to alert option. This is another one of those things, once again, know that this capability exists. All right, so for review, which among the following is not a part of the metrics in the security operations efficiency?
So let's take a gander at these, right, as they come up. Which is among the following is not part of metrics in the security operations efficiency workbook, right? So the instructor went over the SecOps efficiency workbook very briefly. Is about, I think, 9 or 11 different KPIs that were part of that workbook. So basically, we're going to look through these answers and see which one's not part of it, right?
I'm here.
So the mean time to closure, recent activities, incident created over time, and remediation recommendations. My guess is going to be that remediation recommendations is not part of it. I don't think I remember seeing that on the list, and it just, I don't know, it doesn't make as much sense.
Mean time to closure, recent activity, incident created over time, remediation recommendations. The answer is remediation recommendations. The other three certainly are. Question number 2, you can
You can rearrange the placement of different tables in the workbook by selecting, right, either advanced editor, show pin options, settings, or more editing options. You can rearrange the placement of different tables in the workbook. So this is how do you edit workbook tables, right? So the advanced editor, show pin options, settings, more editing options. My guess is advanced editor. Honestly, don't know.
range the placement of different tables in the workbook by selecting advanced editor, show pin options, settings, more editing options. The answer here is show pin options.
So the reason why I always want to review all the questions, and then even in like the practice assessments, I'll go back and grab more of the documentation, is because honestly, like sometimes on the test, like you just start studying for certain things and you just can't remember just the ones that are popping up. So I'll go back and review pin options and workbooks.
So let's recap what we covered. And we've covered a lot. This was a long section. But remember, this section is 50% of the exam, potentially, 50 to 55. So we covered how to plan a Sentinel workspace and configure Sentinel roles. We learned how to design and configure Sentinel data store, how to implement and use Content Hub repositories and community resources, how to identify data sources to be ingested for Sentinel and the prerequisites for Sentinel data, how to configure and use Sentinel data connectors,
right? So throughout this one, we went through a ton of different things, right? We even went through how to configure certain things on our own in my demo lab, right? So I think this is a great place to stop, right? It's already pretty late on a Sunday, and I kind of just wanted to show you guys what different methods of learning you can have for this, right? From Microsoft Learn modules to just Microsoft Learn documentation to different YouTube videos, but there's practice assessments. There's also live practice exam videos, right? And this is a good one, right? Because it's giving us a lot of data to go through and back and study. So tomorrow I'm going to take the practice assessment, and I'm also probably going to go through those workbook pin options, and then I'll probably even dive into a little bit around the different built-in schedule custom queries, just more stuff here in the Sentinel spaces. I'm also going to go through probably roles and permissions for Microsoft Sentinel, and all the different Defender XDRs, just because I think that's going to play a big portion on the exam that we're taking on Wednesday. And just really prepping for those other areas, right? Like I'll probably just live by the fire a little bit on the other pieces, but I really, really want to have a good foundation on Microsoft Sentinel, just because with it being the possibility of 50 to 55% of the test, if I go in feeling a little uneasy about Sentinel, it could be a long hour and a half. So until next time, guys, thanks for hanging out with me for so long. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below.